Walsh. This series is called Care of the Self, and previously we talked about utilization sobriety, a unique way of managing substance use or abuse. And part of that involved developing a signaling system with the unconscious through your fingers. So that one finger lifting up was a yes response from the unconscious, a different finger lifting up was a no response from the unconscious. And this way it's possible to present questions and possibilities to the unconscious and get direct responses. So you'll need that signaling system for what we're about to do. In this segment, we're going to address the resolution of accumulated emotion. So it's acute emotion, accumulated emotion. Chronic emotion will come later. So you'll need to have that signaling system ready to go before you can apply this method. I call this method Goldfinger simply because it utilizes finger signals as communication to the unconscious, and it gets good results typically. Once you have established those finger signals, you can put yourself in a comfortable position and say to the unconscious you'd like to ask some questions and have it respond through your fingers. And then you can begin questioning one emotion at a time. My favorite sequence is addressing fear, guilt, and shame first, because those three emotions tend to be gatekeepers for other things. In other words, sometimes you can't resolve emotional pain or anger until the fear or the guilt or the shame is resolved. So over the years I've learned to approach those three first. So you can ask, is there any fear from the past that I continue to carry at this time? And if you get a yes, you can say, since I've been through all that experience, and I have whatever learning from experience can serve me well in the present, will that fear now be resolved? And if you get a yes, then you can ask the yes finger to lift up when every part of you is free of fear. If you get a no, you can ask, is there something important I need to understand very clearly by way of resolving that fear? If you get a yes, then you can ask that that information become very clear as the fear is resolved. Okay. Now, something I forgot to mention earlier. It's really best if you can have another person with you as you go through this process, because, well, some things are going to be difficult. Some experiences from the past are going to surface by way of resolving that emotion. And it's nice to have some support. You don't have to have that, but realize that you likely are going to recognize that emotion being accumulated and processed and released as it happens. For some people, they really feel the emotion accumulating in their system. For others, they see things from the past. They review history, essentially, as the emotion is gathered up and processed and released, essentially. So it's really different for every person. But if you can have somebody with you as you do this, it's great. If you can't, it's okay. The important thing is that you're going to resolve the emotion. That's what this is all about. So you're going to be able to do this in, well, a rather rapid fashion, because with conventional psychotherapy, it typically takes a whole lot longer than the minutes it typically takes while asking your unconscious to perform this feat. And working with the unconscious, of course, we're utilizing the orientation the unconscious has to time and space, and that can speed things up. All right, so you've asked for information, information has come up, and you've resolved the fear. What if the unconscious says, no, the information is not going to surface? Well, come back to the fear later and ask the same questions. And then you can ask about guilt. Is there any guilt from the past that I continue to carry at this time? If you get a yes, you can say, since I've been through all that experience and I have whatever learning from experience can serve me well in the present, and given the tremendous value and worth that I came into this world with, that's with me now, that's part of who I am, given that I'm never responsible for what other people do or don't do, given all these things, will that guilt now be released and resolved? And if you get a yes, that can happen, and you can ask the yes finger to lift up when you're free of guilt. If you get a no, you can ask, is there something important I need to understand very clearly by way of resolving that guilt? If you get a yes, then you can ask, will that information become very clear to me as the guilt is released and resolved? If you get a yes, then you can ask the yes finger to lift up when you're free of guilt. If you get a no, you can ask, will that information become clear to me now? If you get a yes, then you can await that information coming to conscious awareness. When you get that information, check it out with the unconscious. Speak it out loud and say, is this what I needed to understand? And if you get a yes, then you can ask, will the guilt now be resolved? So keep checking the information until you get a response from the unconscious that indicates you got the right information. So you can go through shame. And I typically, when I ask about shame, I like to define shame as something that causes us to feel like there's something wrong with who we are, like we might have some fatal flaw. Shame can make us feel a little less than the rest of the human race, and more often than not, shame comes about when someone carrying far too much of it spills shame upon us. And once it spills upon us, we accept it as our own, and it just affects everything. So is there any shame from the past that I continue to carry at this time? And if you get a yes, you can go through the same process you did with fear and guilt. And you can ask about anger. You can ask about emotional pain, hurt, or sadness from the past. And ultimately, you can get to depression. And depression is far more than the sadness we attribute to it. Depression is a whole network of experience. The sadness, I should say, is a component of depression, but depression also robs us of our ability to enjoy things we otherwise would enjoy. Depression robs us of motivation and enthusiasm. Depression affects our sleep patterns and our energy level, and depression often paints a pretty grim picture of the future. So it's a whole network of experience. So you can ask, is depression playing a role in my experience at this time? Get a yes, you can ask, will that depression now be resolved so I can be free of it? If you get a yes, you can ask the yes finger to lift up when you're free of depression. If you get a no, you can ask, is there something important I need to understand very clearly by way of resolving that depression? Now, this commonly gets a yes response because depression, as I think about it anyway, well, I used to wonder, what is the evolutionary benefit of depression? How did it evolve in the human system? What purpose does it serve? And when I think about what depression does, it pulls us out of the world. really. And I can't help but wonder if depression is about taking time to determine what needs to change in our life, whether it's something outside us or something within us. Do we need to address certain experiences or emotions? Do we need to change some situation or circumstance on the outside? Depression gives us time to figure out what needs to change. And with many folks I've worked with, once they've identified what needs to change and take the first step toward making that change, the depression lifts. So it kind of affirms what I theorize about. So anyway, it's just a theory. But if you get a yes, information needs to come up. Will that information become very clear as the depression is resolved? If you get a yes, then you can ask the yes finger to lift up when you're free of depression. If you get a no, then ask if the information will come up. And chances are it's about changing something, and chances are as you take the first steps toward change, the depression will lift. Okay. So then there's another condition we call anxiety. Future fear. Fear about something that hasn't happened yet and may never happen, that has a powerful effect on us in the present. Is there any anxiety in my experience at this time? If you get a yes, will that anxiety now be released and resolved? If you get a yes, then you can ask the yes finger to lift up when every part of you is free of anxiety. If you get a no, is there some information I need to understand very clearly by way of resolving that anxiety? If you get a yes, will that information become very clear as the anxiety is released and resolved? If you get a yes, then that can happen, and you can ask the yes finger to lift up when you really are free of anxiety. If you get a no, you can ask that that information become very clear now. And if you get a no to that, will that information become very clear to me within the next 24 hours, within the next 2 days, within the next week? And if you get a yes to any of those questions, then you can just wait until that information surfaces and come back to the anxiety again for resolution. So once you've resolved all the emotion you want or need to resolve, then you can ask the unconscious, now that I'm free of those emotional burdens, is there a place in the past to put the thoughts and perceptions and sensory experience that's no longer appropriate in the present? And if you get a yes, then you can ask the yes finger to lift up when that adjustment is complete. If you get a no, you can explain to the unconscious, now that these emotions are resolved, I want to resolve potential triggers to the emotions, and particular thoughts, particular perceptions, particular sensory experience can actually trigger those emotions to come back, and I don't want that. We've all had the experience of smelling something and going through a time warp back to some experience, or hearing some music and going through a time warp back to some experience. So the sensory experience, in addition to thoughts and perceptions, can invite the emotion back. So you can explain this to the unconscious and then ask again, is there a place in the past to put those thoughts, perceptions, and sensory experience that's no longer appropriate in the present? After the explanation, you'll likely get a yes, so that can happen. So this is the Goldfinger process. Now, I'm going to address one other aspect that I think is very important, because the heart typically functions independent of the rest of the system. And it's kind of strange, and I've heard from several cardiologists I talked to over the years, they think that the heart has its own mind. So consider that the heart just typically functions independent of other things. So we've just released a whole lot of emotion, but I'm going to ask the heart, is the heart continuing to carry emotional pain at this time? And if I get a yes, then I will say the heart has a right to heal, and it can't really heal if it's continuing to carry that emotional pain. It may be carrying other things that it needs to get rid of in order to heal as well. So will that emotional pain and whatever else the heart needs to get rid of now be released and resolved in whatever way is truly best for me at this time? And if you get a yes, that can happen, and you can ask the yes finger to lift up when the heart is really free of that emotional pain and whatever else it needed to get rid of. Once that happens, then I like to ask, will the heart now be able to heal in the best way possible? Most often I get a yes response to that. Okay, once the heart is free of that emotional pain, there's something else to consider. Most of us human beings, if we experience heartbreak or really significant emotional heart pain during the growing up years, our system develops a protective network around the heart to make sure that it never ever again experiences that same level of emotional pain. Now, this protective network is really quite helpful, and well, it has a good function, and it's particularly good during the growing up years. And that protective network makes sure that we never get close enough to anyone to experience that same level of emotional pain if we lose that someone or something. So we can get this close, but no further. If we go further than that, the protective network will create devices to develop distance and keep the heart safe. It might produce a lot of anxiety to create some distance. It can do all kinds of creative things to create emotional distance, only allowing a particular level of closeness to anyone or anything. Okay, well, as adults, this protective network continues to function, and it prevents us from experiencing the full depth of connection and closeness that the heart craves, that the heart really longs for. So in intimate relationships, it maintains a certain level of distance, and well, that creates problems, as you might imagine. So if I'm working with an adult, I will ask, since you now have learning and coping strategies and all kinds of adaptive mechanisms that allow you to recover from heartbreak should it happen, will that protective network around the heart now be dismantled so that the heart can get what it really needs? Now, of course, before asking this question, I will just get confirmation. I'll ask, is there a protective network around the heart? And typically it's a yes. So then I'll ask if the network can be dismantled. There's typically a long pause. And be patient, awaiting a response. If the response is yes, then that can happen, and you can ask the yes finger to lift up when that protective network is completely dismantled. If it's a no response, then you can ask, is there something important I really need to understand by way of dismantling that protective network? And if you get a yes to that, you can ask that that information become very clear. Await the information, and then out loud check out what information you received to make sure it's correct, and then ask that the protective network be dismantled. Okay. Once this protective network is dismantled, beware, the heart will be a little fickle, or a lot fickle. It has freedom that it has not had for a long time. It's a little giddy, and it can be very inclined to fall into infatuation, to really go crazy over almost anybody. So beware of this and keep your mind, keep the head in the game all the time. I'll tell you a little story. Years ago, I worked with a woman. She was about 40 years old, and she dismantled that protective mechanism. And I warned her, as I'm warning you, to just keep your head in the game. Be wary, because the heart is just going to, well, be quite giddy and sometimes quite fickle. So she said when she came into her next appointment, she said, I'm glad you gave me the warning, because it was the gas station attendant. I just flipped over him. I wanted to jump on his bones. And she said she kept her head in the game. She didn't say anything to him. She paid for the gas and got out of there. But she realized her heart was just having a great time. So, okay. So in our next sequence, we're going to talk about chronic emotional conditions, chronic physical conditions, chronic conditions that you will be able to manage. But for now, I want to thank you for watching, and realize that this information can be found in the Utilization Sobriety book, as well as the newest book, Care of the Self, Owner's Manual. All right, see you next time.